Hi, I'm Dalla, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us. We're streaming this live to YouTube and LinkedIn right now. And so for those that have questions, comments, they want to offer some feedback, insights, whatever, we'll be able to share those with you throughout our conversation today. And like I said, I'm really excited to kind of talk to you about the book. Thank you so much again for taking the time. It seems weird. I said this to you before we hit record, before we went live. Why is a guy whose main thing is productivity and time management, what's he want to talk to me about my book for? Like, but there's so much about data and there's so much about numbers. And when I talk about being productive, there's this mix of quality and quantity that I think we miss out on. And you address that in your own way inside of this book with relation to, the songs, the biggest songs out there. But I'd love for you for those that are not familiar with you and familiar with the experiment that kind of led to the writing of this book, share that with those that are here that may not be familiar with you or don't follow you on TikTok like I do.
Yeah, it was sort of a circuitous process. My background is currently work in the music industry, and I work for a streaming service called AudioMax, specifically processing data, doing data analytics. So music and data is sort of my shtick. I also play songs. I've always played in bands, written music, released it, all that jazz. And years ago, I decided I was going to listen to every song to ever get to number one on the Billboard Hot 100. Why? Well, at the time I was working a different job and I was just looking for some musical way to unwind my day. And I came up with this scheme to listen to every number one hit ever, just one song a day. At the end of the day, I'd sit down, listen to it once or twice, play along on my guitar. And because I worked with data even at that time, I started tracking some things about these songs, and slowly these basic facts that I was tracking ballooned into this humongous spreadsheet about number one hits going from 1958 to basically today. Noticed some trends, and I started first talking about it on the internet, and eventually that turned into this data-driven history of popular music that is coming out soon.
Now, for those that aren't familiar, how many years of number one hits did you have to listen to? Like, when did the Hot 100 begin?
Yeah, so the Billboard has had music charts since like the 1930s. They weren't initially a music magazine, and as the name suggests, they would track like in the 1800s bill postings and flyers and stuff like that. Eventually, they started covering entertainment. Entertainment specifically then went to music, and they had intermittent charts. I think from the 30s onward. In 1958, August 1958, they roll out the Hot 100, whose goal was to aggregate all charts together to find the most popular song in the US. And when I say all charts, I mean all different formats. And at that time, it was sales, radio, and jukeboxes. Over the last 65 years, they've taken into account other things, digital downloads, in the mid 2000s, ringtones, streams, all that stuff all gets thrown in there, and they're still trying to find the most popular records in the US per week. But yeah, August 58 was when it started. So there's been almost 1,200 number one hits since then.
One of the things that I found right out of the gate that was fascinating to me, and I mean, not only the experiment that hooked me, but one fact was the Bob fact right out of the gate, where you talk about the Bobs that were number ones. And this is something that I don't think a lot of people would think about. And this was kind of the idea of, for me, how someone who had such a massive impact on the musical, music, yet how are they not somebody that was number one? So you mentioned the Bobs that topped the top 100. Which Bob did not top the top 100, and how is that even remotely possible?
Yeah, so right on page one of the book, I mention, I don't know, I say it's something like 13 people named Bob have topped the Billboard Hot 100, 14 if you count B.O.B., who was a rapper in the mid 2000s, but none of them were Bob Dylan. And surprised me at first. That's why I included it, and that was also part of the reason I started listening was as I found a playlist on Spotify that had every number 1 hit, and I just started searching around, and I noticed some weird stuff, so I was like, "I should listen to all these." Um, but no, Bob Dylan's never had a number 1 hit. I agree, Bob Dylan's one of my favorite musicians of all time. I think he's undoubtedly one of the most influential and important musicians of the 20th century, and he got to number 2 twice in the '60s with Like a Rolling Stone and Rainy Day Woman. He also wrote a number 1 hit, the Byrds cover of his song Mr. Tambourine Man
Hmm.
topped the charts, but Dylan himself never performed a number 1 hit, unless you count, like, We Are the World, but I don't count that. I'm
Sure.
thinking, solo Bob Dylan, and the reason for that, and this is often what surprises people, is first, the Billboard Hot 100 is calculated once per week. Second, within any given week, there's gonna be random stuff that happens to be very popular, which makes it very hard to have a number 1 hit. You might have the biggest song of your career, and there may be some random one-hit wonder who just has a huge record in that 1 week. Oh, bad luck. And maybe in the next week, you would have had a number 1 hit with the sales you had, but you I'm phrasing this incorrectly. Here's a better example.
Sure.
Let's say in week 1, Bob Dylan sold 100 records and there's some random number 1 hit that sold 200. All right, he's doesn't get his number 1 hit. Let's say in a different week, then the biggest selling record only sold 10 copies and number 2 sold 8. Uh, Bob Dylan, had he released his song that week, would have had a number 1, but just the fact that he did not, he ends up not having a number 1 hit. So there is a little bit of randomness in what gets to the top of the charts and what doesn't. It doesn't mean that those things aren't popular, but that's part of the reason I like number 1 hits is you sort of get a random-ish sample of popular music at the time rather than just like, "Oh, these are the greatest records of all time." You get to a better picture of what was actually going on.
So when I was reading the book, I decided let's look and see what, because I was born on a Wednesday, so it was in between in 1974 the charts, the number ones
Yeah.
that were released. So this is a classic example of what you're just talking about. Because number one, I was born during the disco era, obviously, right? 74 is like right there. But the song that was number one before I was born and leading up to it was Sundown by Gordon Lightfoot, Canadian.
Mhm.
Made me feel good. Then the next week, it was Rock the Boat by Hughes Corporation. So very different songs. And this happened a lot, right? Like, I mean, it wasn't just something I noticed in that time frame, but as I was reading the book, I'm like, there's a lot of oscillating back and forth, things that maybe don't necessarily make sense in terms of trends and such. And like, was that something that you just kept seeing again and again, and you kind of dug into that? Like, those two songs are very different songs.
Totally. I think I took a lot of things away from this listening journey. One of them where it was in every generation, in every era, in every decade, there's great music and there's bad music. We usually just don't listen to the bad stuff anymore. It gets swept away, and only the good stuff remains, which makes the past look a lot rosier than it actually was. But also, people's tastes have always been quite varied. The Sundown and the Rock the Boat is actually a great example of that. You almost have whiplash if you were to listen to those 2 songs back to back. But I would notice that constantly throughout the entire journey, and I would argue that there were some eras or some years where there was more variation than others. But in general, I mean, people aren't monolithic in their tastes, even in terms of the most popular things that they listen to. Things remain quite varied, which I thought was kind of nice to realize.
Well, it's very human too, right? Like, it seems
Yeah.
again, and I want to go back to the beginning because we talk about numbers, and in the work I do, obviously checking off as many boxes as possible, getting a lot done seems to be productive, but then the quality of what that output is might vary depending on what it is, and if you're not dedicating enough effort or time or what have you to it. But you look at the data, and you developed your own kind of metric to assess a song's quality. And I'd love for you to go over that, because that had to, number one, be challenging for you to say, okay, how do I take these numbers and go, this is what makes a song, quote, good, or of quality is probably a better way to put it. So can you touch on those kind of metric points?
Yeah, I thought this was one of the fun parts of the book and the listening journey was I started listening by myself when I was about, I don't know, 10 or 15 songs, and I told my buddy Vinny about this, and he was like, "Oh, I'll do that too. I'll listen with you." So every day I would text him a song, and we would chat about it for a couple minutes, and we would both rate the song out of 10. I would track the ratings, and then I tried to involve other people in it. I would cycle through a third person and have them also rate the song. So for every single number 1 hit, we would have 3 ratings, 1 from me and 1 from my friend. We listened through all of them, and 1 from a rotating third person. So my thought process was if I get 3 people who are all like, "Wow, this is a great song," all right, then it's probably at least pretty good. Same thing if you get 3 people that say, "This is a horrendous song." And at the end of every chapter, I talk about the 3 highest rated, lowest rated songs, along with the one that sparked the most disagreement, meaning there was a big disparity between the highest and lowest ratings for that song. And in my gut, I feel like there is some platonic form of what makes a good song. It's not an objective science, and I don't pretend that in the book. It's just, no matter what you think about if you could prove something is great or not, every single person I've ever met in my life has opinions on what makes good music or not. And I think it's important to engage with that, whether we're doing something super scientific or not. I say in the book, I want these to be conversation starters rather than conversation enders.
Yeah. Yeah,
So I guess,
you
yeah,
definitely allude to that. Like you say, like this is, you love to have conversations about music that is you might think is not good or is bad versus somebody else who thinks it's good. Like that kind of discourse is because it's like you said, it's subjective, right? Like it's very tricky. And this is the
yeah.
same thing in the work that I talk about is somebody could be really, really good at making Excel spreadsheets and somebody else could suck at it. Uh, does that mean one person is better than the other? Like, no, I mean, or the kind of effort or energy it would take for somebody to build an Excel spreadsheet if they're not good at it versus somebody who's really good at it. Like there's so much subjectivity that exists and we tend to lose that nuanced aspect. One of the things that I noticed, especially I got into the later chapters, is the cyclical stuff, the stuff that comes back around. Like, in the first
Mhm.
chapter where you explore the early era of the Hot 100, you talk about the link between theater and Hollywood and music. And then it kind
Yep.
of weakens. But then in the like my son is literally watching Footloose right now because he's auditioning for the musical Footloose. And I'm like, yeah, like that song Footloose by Kenny Loggins was written for that, right? So
Yep.
it came back around. Did you find that cyclical stuff showed up regularly? And maybe is there one cyclical thing that kind of surprised you as you were listening to, and going through your research for the book?
There are certain I joke at the end of the book because often going on this journey, people would ask me, "Oh, did you discover some secret to writing a hit song?" And I'm like, "Well, if I discovered the secret, I would have written the song instead of writing a book. Writing a book takes forever." So no, I didn't discover a secret, but there are certain threads, and that's what I think you're alluding to, that are they ebb and flow, but they're relatively consistent for what makes a song popular. A song being associated with another form of media over the last 65 years is relatively consistent, whether that's movies, television, or theater. Theater, not as much anymore. I don't write about this in the book as much, but in like the 40s, that was a much bigger thing. But you're totally right. I mean, in the 80s, movies come roaring back, and I think MTV literally changed how we shot movies in that era, where there are certain sequences in movies that almost play like music videos rather than, something you would expect out of your typical Hollywood movie.
Right.
And that still exists. Over the last decade or so, there have not been as many, songs from movies and television shows that have been huge hits, but it still happens. "Shallow" by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper came from A Star Is Born, that was a huge hit. There was a big Post Malone song that was from a Spider-Man movie, so that still exists, but even so, a lot of songs become popular they start becoming popular on TikTok now. A lot of those songs are associated with some dance on the app, and 60 years ago, people were dancing the twist in the same way that when I was in middle school, people were dancing to "Crank That" by Soulja Boy. In the '70s, it was The Hustle. I mean, dance crazes are also pretty consistent throughout the entirety of the Hot 100. They look different, maybe they're transmitted differently, but people are still looking to move their bodies to music and see songs associated with other forms of media. I think those are 2 very consistent trends with significant ebbs and flows.
Sure. And I mean, you bring up the MTV aspect, and that's it's long been held that like Christopher Cross, who was doing really, really well, as soon as they saw what he looked like, it's like, ooh, right. Same thing though. It could be said, and this story has been passed on is when Kennedy and Nixon were going, they had that televised debate, and as soon as people saw Kennedy versus Nixon, all of a sudden television played a role in that too. So it doesn't just happen in music, but it is fascinating that. And you actually bring up Christopher Cross's Arthur's theme at one point, which is just the lyrics and stuff. And I want to talk about some of the timeless lyrics that
Mhm.
you came across during. We alluded to Bob Dylan earlier, and obviously there was just a movie that came out. It was late last year. Obviously he's still and the younger generation have embraced it. You mentioned TikTok, Let Down by Radiohead, charted this
Mhm.
year after being, it's over, I think it's almost 26 years old, I think that album, or something in that range. So can you tell me some of those timeless lyrics, not unlike, again, the lyric from Arthur's theme that, I look at that and I listen to that song. I'm like, oh my God, it's so succinct and perfect. Were there others that stood out?
Yeah, I mean, there's great lyrics in every generation. Some lyrics that always come to mind for me, funny enough, were lyrics that I did not know were lyrics from popular songs that I had heard growing up, just my mother saying. One from, um, Neil Diamond and Barbara Streisand's, "You Don't Bring Me Flowers" is, uh, used to it used to be, it used to be so natural to talk about forever. Now used to be's don't count anymore. They just lay on the floor till we sweep them away. I mean, that is to me, that is pop poetry. And, I don't go to a pop song looking for Langston Hughes or Walt Whitman, but, that's tremendous, tremendous writing from Neil Diamond there. Uh, that comes to I mean, the Arthur theme one is great.
And didn't you
Um
mention in the book the Neil Diamond and Barbara Streisand? Those are two mashed up versions. Like they didn't actually sing it. Is that true? I mean, I guess it is. But I thought that they sang the duet together, but they were separate recordings,
so
weren't they?
So they did ultimately sing it together.
Okay.
What happened was they had both recorded the song, and then I think the guy's name was Gary Guthrie. I don't know what metro area he was in. He was a radio DJ, and he was like, "Oh, they sang this in the same key. I could play them together." And then people started requesting it, and then the label was like, "All right, let's make an official recording here." So that's how that happened. But yeah, it was a guy a random guy that realized, "Hey, you guys should probably be singing this song together." Um Yeah, so that song always comes to mind.
Yeah. I wanna talk about later in the book. You talk about Douglas Adams's article where he mentions that our relationship with technology, because I mean, and this is great. I actually have, you can't see it here, but actually have Douglas Adams's journals, the 42 project that was done on Kickstarter. And just to see some of his scribblings and notes was great. But here's what he says, and you quoted this in the book: everything that's already in the world when you're born is just normal. Anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative. And with any luck, you can make a career out of it. And then anything that gets invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things, the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it. until it's been around for about 10 years when it gradually turns out to be all right, really. And you follow that up with, I try to think about this list anytime I have a knee-jerk reaction that a new technology is either scary or stupid, especially in the realm of music. So, uh, when did you recognize? I mean, the drum machine you talk about, Napster is another piece of technology that comes up. Like, there's lots of which one do you think that when you were kind of before you went through this project, that knee jerk reaction was the one that you can remember the most as being the most like palpable?
I definitely growing up, and this discourse still exists around pitch correction or auto tune. People have a very visceral reaction to this, even though we process instruments in so many crazy ways, and the whole idea of recording something is that it is you're able to manipulate it, and the fact that we get very touchy about manipulating vocals in any way. In certain cases, we don't. No one gets mad if you're compressing a voice or if you're adding some delay or echo to a voice. Uh, but yeah, I was definitely growing up. I was on the side of that auto tune is unnatural and should be uh, removed from this world if at all possible. I'm less like that now. I'm like, well, a lot of people use it as a vocal effect, and in certain senses, I'm like, even if you are using it just to correct pitch, it's not like before that people weren't recording a bunch of different takes of a vocal and grabbing the best one. There are certain differences between those approaches, but I don't think auto tune or pitch correction is the end of the world anymore. The one recently that I'm still grappling with is generative AI in the music space. There are
Yeah.
these the most prominent company right now that I say is this company called Suno, where you go enter a sentence or a description and it'll spit back 2 recordings to you. And I'm just like, like I said, I play music, I've recorded, I have instruments within an arm's length of me right now. And to me, it almost makes me want to throw up. I'm like, what? This is a very unmusical act. But I'm like, am I just having the same reaction that people had 100 years ago when radio was invented or when
Yeah.
recording was invented or X, Y, and Z? I mean, there are constant technological fights, and I try to trace that throughout the book. Now, I do think there are some differences between these generative technologies because of how they are built. They require thousands upon thousands of copyrighted recordings to be built, and I do think that should at the very least require some compensation for people, even if you're going to accept the technology as is. But still, I at the end of the book when I talk about generative audio, it leaves me uneasy still.
Well, yeah, and I mean the Beatles Now and Then that came out last year, people were really up in arms about that. But Paul said, "Well, we would have leaned into this hard if John was alive. He would have leaned into some of this." And now that's not pure generative. That's because they obviously were manipulating it in
Yeah.
a different way. But I mean, yeah, I saw Rick Beato's channel where he actually used that tool you were talking about, and it was like I think he prefaced it by just saying there's a song, and then he eventually said, "By the way, that's AI." Like I think he kind of hooked us. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. By the way, Janet, who's listening on YouTube in big part, she said this is one of her lyrics, which I love. Yeah, Ricky Nelson's Garden Party. You can't please everyone, so you have to please yourself. Like just that. I don't
Yeah.
think Garden Party ever went to number one. Did it go to number one? Was it? I don't remember.
No, it didn't. It didn't. Ricky Nelson had 2 number 1s in he had the first number 1 ever, Poor Little Fool, and the
Hmm.
second one, it was either late 50s, early 60s, Travelin' Man. So no, not number 1, but I love that song.
Do you, when you were going through the kind of the arc, especially because you were doing it chronologically, are you able to figure out, or do you think you've got a sense of what the next trend might be now because you've seen it, or is it just so varied and wild that because it's art, like it's hard for you to pinpoint that, or do you maybe see what's coming next beyond obviously the technological stuff we just talked about?
I mean, it's weird. I feel like in the music industry right now, all of the conversations are focused around technology. Um, but I think there are. something I've talk about frequently is the company that I work for, Audiomack, is quite popular in Africa,
Hmm.
and we're real Nigeria's really become I think, a musical cultural center for the world, or is becoming a cultural center for the world, and some artists from not just Nigeria, but West Africa in general have started to cross over into the US and other countries. I think over the next decade, we're gonna see, like, a genuine global African music star in the same way that throughout the 2010s, Latin American artists really started to cross over in the US to the point where pop music and Latin music are almost indistinguishable. That's what I personally think just based on, if they're making great music, it's really catching on. Some American and British artists are collaborating with these people. I think we're gonna see a big star come out of that region
So,
in the next couple of years.
so Paul Simon was ahead of the curve with Graceland, then I guess, right? Is that what it was? Is
Yeah,
it? Oh no, the Obvious
y
Child. The Obvious Child is the album that he really leaned into some of the African stuff. I think more, if I remember correctly.
yeah, I think Graceland also I believe that was in South Africa, but yeah, I mean, South Africa, there's a rich electronic music scene down
Mm.
there too, um, but yeah, I think, yeah, Paul Simon was ahead of the curve.
Um,
Not the Go
I
on,
want to I
sorry.
want to dive. No, no, that's okay. I want to get back to the numbers aspect because um how you measure is just important as what gets measured. And as I went through the book, I mean, I think if I remember correctly, initially, like the way you, and you brought this up earlier to a degree, is you did sheet music was the sales, like that's where the numbers came from, right? Like, and you would go into a store and there were different renditions, so you had to be able to at least go, this is the one I want, and they go, oh yeah, no, I've heard that here, this is the one you want, like here's the sheet music you want. Then it shifted, and now SoundScan, I guess, and Spotify, like all these different ways of numerically or quantifiably measuring. um y- what were some of the things that you noticed? I know you mentioned in the book how SoundScan kind of maybe removed some of the bias from the old way that it was being kind of calculated. uh this pursuit of figuring out what the right measurement tool is, what are your thoughts around that? Because I mean, now that Spotify's in there, now obviously TikTok's playing a role. We already mentioned how Let Down jumped to the top of the charts, or charted at least,
Mhm.
because of it. Like, what are some of the things that you say, that either they get wrong, or that, the dangers of maybe using a different certain ways of measuring? I mean, again, payola played a huge role at certain points in time too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is ultimately a somewhat of an impossible task to figure out what is the most popular song right now. I mean, that's always what Billboard has been after, and it's important, I think, to remember that Billboard was started as, like, or was an industry publication. If you go into any record label these days, there's usually still copies of Billboard, laying around. It's also a consumer magazine, but it's an industry publication, and they're trying to find out, for people who work in the industry, what is the most popular song, the same way that I'm sure there is a industry publication for, I don't know, the consumer batteries or something, and you could read that and find out, whose brand of double A's is selling the most. So I think that context is important to understand, and it's also important to understand that what Billboard is measuring has changed. Whereas previously they were looking at radio and record sales, and I think record sales were ultimately more important at that time. Whereas now with streaming, we're really looking at consumption. So the equivalent would be if in the 1980s, rather than Billboard tracking that you purchased Against All Odds by Phil Collins, they would be tracking how many times you actually spun that record on your turntable. So the chart is the same in name, but it's really what it's measuring is dramatically different. We're tracking listening habits now rather than spending habits. And because people with their subscriptions can try out almost anything, there's going to be a lot of things that chart or get popular that are only listened to very passively, where that wasn't as popular back in the day, where you had to go out and, decide, okay, I would like to purchase this because I want to listen to it. And you may be disappointed with what it came with, what you actually ended up getting. Um, so yeah, that's what I think the people at Billboard have a very difficult job, and they do the best that they can with the information that they have, but it's ultimately a nearly impossible task.
The Professor Rock has a great YouTube channel for those that don't follow him, and I love the Bridesmaids stuff that he does. I think it's a series that it's fairly recent. So the number twos. Did you, as you were
Mm.
going through the experiment, look at, and I think it comes up a couple of times if I remember correctly in the book, where you're like, this bridesmaid, this number two, was kept out of number one by something that should never have kept number one qualitatively. Like those ones that just stall there. Were there some examples where you're like, how in the world did this happen? Or was it, or were you able to actually say, oh, this is exactly why this happened?
Like I said, I mean, it's especially back then, I mean, there was certainly imprecision, so
Hmm.
they would definitely know that these 2 records were very popular that were 1 and 2, but it was probably difficult in certain cases to say that one was dramatically more popular than the other to
Hmm.
eke out a victory at number 1. You know, some that come to mind, I mentioned in the book, the Kingsmen's garage rock classic Louie Louie got stuck behind a very obscure, forgotten '60s number 1 hit called, this, Dominique by the Singing Nun, who was a
Yes.
Catholic nun, and, you know, that's a forgotten song. If you're a rock music fan, Louie Louie's a classic. Uh, Dylan, I think in some cases, you're like, "Oh, I understand why that happened." I think Like a Rolling Stone got caught behind Help by the Beatles, so I'm like, "Alright, too bad, Bob. You put your song out the wrong week."
Well, and the Carpenters
Help.
had a lot too. I know that Professor Rock in the '70s, like the Carpenters were like number two a lot behind the number ones of that era. Like it's so interesting to see that.
Yeah, I mean, a fun fact, the artist that has the most number 2 hits ever without having a number 1 is Creedence Clearwater. I think they got to number 2, like, 8 different times, and I don't know who blocked them every single time, but they can never get to the top of the charts. And like I said, you know, that's had they released the song in a different week, it's possible that they would have topped the charts. It's not to say that they aren't popular, but they had some bad luck. Another one I always think about in the '90s, there's a song that I love called I Love You Always Forever, and it got stuck at number 2 because the Macarena was on its number 1 tear, so, you know, bad time to release your biggest song, Donna Lewis. Uh,
One of the things that I've noticed, especially now, I mean, you actually can see it behind me here, is my record player. I actually have a record player I acquired. I'm getting back into vinyl, because my son, who's now loving music and knew that I used to. I actually worked at a college radio station for a number of years, and that was during the like early '90s, so definitely during the beginnings of grunge and all that stuff and alt rock, more modern rock, I guess, as Alan Cross would call it. But one of the things I'm curious about as somebody who's not only gone through this experiment, wrote a book about it, but the return. It seems like there's a return to the complete album versus the singles, like singles being pulled as opposed to like there seems to be like a back and forth that's happened historically around that. I don't know if you could speak to that, if you see that maybe with the return of vinyl to popularity that the album, like the full story of the album is now something that artists are shooting for because like you pointed out, it's such a moving target, the numbers game.
mhm. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, obviously back in the day, if I wanted to buy a if I liked one Mariah Carey song, for example, in the '90s, I had no choice but to buy the whole album. I that made it look like she had huge well, she did have huge album sales
Hmm.
numbers, but there were probably a lot of people that would buy those CDs and just listen to a couple songs on them. what we saw with the rise of music on the internet is that people were actually doing this. You know, you would just buy specific songs, you would rip apart albums and put them back together however you wanted. I think people sometimes overstate the death of the album because when you look at who the most popular artists in the world are, like Taylor Swift and Beyonce, I mean, their fans are still rabid for their albums. You know, the album is not a dead format. Um, and the vinyl revival is an interesting, I'd say, addendum to that. There is interest A in physical media, and B, you know, there is interest in the album as an artistic statement. I think most artists still think about the if you're a serious artist, you put out good albums. One interesting tidbit about the vinyl revival is that when they survey younger people who are purchasing vinyl, many of them don't own record players. It's like you are buying the vinyl just as something to I mean, you can see I have that's not a piece of vinyl. It's like I think it's a piece of aluminum with Abbey Road on it. You know,
Yeah.
you're buying it as, like, something to display on the wall, which I find, it sounds like an expensive, hobby,
Yeah,
but
I have 3 up top there. There's actually a store in our mall that does, like, these plaque mounted album covers. So I actually have the White
cool.
Album, Kid A, and OK Computer up on that wall. And my son has In Rainbows in his room, as well as I think he has, probably I think he has In Utero. But yeah, like, he doesn't own a single album, and I don't. I actually own the White Album, but I don't own the other 2 Radiohead albums yet.
Okay.
But yeah, it is
Yeah.
it's interesting to see, because you're right, like, and that's mostly what those shops have is album covers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you of course, you there's a record store. I live in Hoboken, New Jersey. I right around the corner from a record store. I mean, it's quite popular. They have events there. When like an artist comes in, I mean, there's a line out the door. I don't know if everyone who's going in there to buy vinyl owns a record player, but you know, physical media is a great way to support artists, so I'm all for the trend.
Janet actually mentions in the earlier days you could buy a 45. There's still singles out there now, but what you bring up in the book too is the advent of adding visuals to the records as well, right? Like that art, like the meshing of the visual plus the audio. It's that senses kind of stuff I think is really interesting. Um, can we touch on that a little bit as we get close to wrapping up, the idea of like the merging of senses? We talked about the TV aspect of things, obviously the video aspect, but we're seeing it in other things like playlist artwork nowadays and so on. So like adding your own personal touches, again, that that inviting of quality for your own experience, your own personal experience versus, hey, here's what Spotify's delivering to you as the daily, your weekly hits or what have you.
Yeah, there is in the '30s, there was a guy named Alex Steinweiss who worked for Columbia Records, and he realized that if they put an engaging image on the cover of albums, they usually sold more copies. Before that, you know, albums were just sold in, like, brown paper bags or generic packaging that just said who the record label was. And singles were largely sold the same way, except for bigger artists until the 1980s when MTV comes along and image becomes as important, if not more important, than the songs that you are putting out. I mean, there are countless songs in the MTV '80s where it's very clear, you know, the song is not that strong, but there's an engaging music video or the artist is attractive or something. And
Rio
we
comes
still
to
cer
mind. Rio comes to mind right out of the gate by Duran Duran.
Yeah,
That artwork is symbolic, I think, just as much, if not more, than the song.
totally. I mean, there were artists that were good at both, like Prince and Madonna, where they could make compelling sonic musical works, but also pair them with engaging visuals, and those visuals were just as important to and of course, Michael Jackson, how could I forget him? You know, those visuals were just as important to why they became popular, and we still exist under that paradigm today. If you wanna be a musician, I mean, you have to be a visual artist too. You can't be, you know, poor Christopher Cross or for some reason, I always think Helen Reddy and this big '70s star that seemed like she wouldn't have thrived in the '80s, if her career I don't know, she never really had hits in the '80s. She did have a television show in the '70s, but
L-
regardless
Linda Ronstadt comes to mind. I mean, she could have, but she didn't lean into it as hard, I think.
Yeah, there are lots of 70 I mean, it was that transition was hard for a lot of people, and a lot of those 70s, like, rock artists who tried to go after the 80s aesthetic, like, failed. I know that ZZ Top, who was very popular in the 80s, when they became popular during the MTV era, they went back and remixed all the old songs to have more of that 80s sheen on it,
Mm.
and then, like, in the 90s, they were like, "Actually, these new mixes are horrible," so then they didn't those aren't available anymore. Um, so yeah, it was hard for a lot of artists to make that transition, and many didn't, but we still live in that world. The visuals are just as important as music if you wanna be a pop star. If you don't wanna be
Sure.
a pop star, then do whatever you want.
Well, and I think in the 70s, you bring this up in the book, like the artists were older too, right? They were skewing older than they were in previous eras. So to make that shift, like James Taylor would be an example. I love James Taylor. He was able to do it to a degree, but it took him a while, like to get that, I mean, his music's amazing, but to get to pair up the visual aspect, I think took longer.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the, like, late '70s and early '80s is the height of the bald pop star era. Your Phil Collins, Mark Knopfler of the world. We don't really see that anymore, and I think the average pop star for most of the last 65 years is, like, around 25. In the '80s, it got all the way up to, like, between 30 and 32, which is ancient in pop years. So it was unique in that sense too, where at the same time you had visuals becoming more important. You had some more mature looking pop stars, which is an interesting phenomenon. I don't think there's a causal relationship between those two things, but they did happen around the same time.
Well, Chris, before I let you go, I mean, at the end of the book, you talk about some eternal musical truths. I don't want you to share those. I want people to read the book and get those. But what I want you to maybe think about is a myth that you had either held or that you had heard that through this writing of this book and this experiment that you were able to kind of go, nah, not quite.
Yeah, I definitely grew up a classic rock kid. I was of the opinion that Led Zeppelin and bands of that ilk were making the greatest music of all time, and I still love all of that music. But there is the long, ancient tradition that between, like, rock music and pop music or dance music, and in the '70s, the thing that was held in comparison to the seriousness of rock music was disco music. It was supposedly this plastic style, that was filled with horrible songs, and of course, there are bad disco songs, but during this journey, I really came to realize how rich of a musical tradition, disco also had, and just because the productions were often more polished did not mean that the songs were necessarily worse. There are good rock songs, and there are bad rock songs, there are good disco songs, and there are bad disco songs. But at its best, I gotta pat the disco practitioners on their back. They made some great music, and I did not go in thinking that I would think that coming out the other side.
Yeah, you know, the one thing that I right out of the gate when I was reading the book was you alluded to this earlier is that we tend to think that the music of bygone eras, our earlier eras, is way better than what is coming out currently. And as I was going through the book, first off, I didn't even realize that Into Club is like 20 plus years old by 50 Cent. I'm like that, but I did know that How You Remind Me by Nickelback was that age. So again, it's what you're listening to. It to me, I
Yeah.
was just that journey, and I really do appreciate you not only writing this book, which is called Uncharted Territory: What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves, but also the TikTok stuff that you do. I mean, that's how I found you. Yes, I am a 50 plus year old man who is checking out people on TikTok and loving some of the stuff that's out there. There's some stuff that I like tend to steer away from, but now I'm probably clearly in the music algorithm thanks to
Yeah.
consuming what you put out there. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the program today. And where can people learn more about you, and where can they pick up the book?
Yeah, I'm an easy guy to find online. If you search Chris Dalla Riva, you'll find me on basically every platform. My handle's almost always C Dalla Riva Music. I'm most active on TikTok, Instagram, and I have a newsletter called Can't Get Much Higher where I talk about the same stuff that I talk about in the book and on my TikTok. It's all about music and data, which is usually music with a couple fun charts. And the book is available online everywhere. Barnes& and Noble, Amazon, from the publisher, Bloomsbury, Walmart. You could online, you'll be able to get it anywhere. I don't think it'll physically be available in stores, so you could pick up a digital or physical copy online from wherever you see fit. Just search Uncharted Territory and it should come up.
Thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today, Chris.
Thanks for having me.